Islam is a transformative path like no other. You're challenging the air that they breathe.
Yeah.
Questioning it is very, very difficult.
If Islam was so successful, then why did we leave all of that and embrace a Western modernity?
We in the Muslim world mistook a martial victory for an intellectual victory.
That's a Sufi way of thinking, separating the sacred law from the spirit.
Nazism, liberalism, and communism, they are all different manifestations of the same phenomenon, which is modernity. It's not possible to import liberalism elsewhere. Islam won't come in and be a polite minority. Gaza is the real mask-off moment.
How do Muslims deal with what looks like the comprehensive success of Western civilization? Is it time to accept defeat, as one writer put it? Or does Islam have something to offer the world that can move us beyond this dysfunctional system? Our guest today is Hasan Spiker. He argues that modernity is Western and its embrace is a means to Western hegemony and domination. He's the author of this soon-to-be-published book, published on the 26th of November, The Unraveling of Intelligibility. Hasan Spiker, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam, Jalal. Lovely to see you again.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us, and I think we've got a really interesting conversation today about many topics which I think come together. And I think a lot of our Muslims and non-Muslim viewers would like to understand just how Islam fits in to the modern world, and whether Islam can fit into the modern world. And there's a lot to unpack here, but there's also a lot to define. Even modern world needs a definition. But let's start with your framework. You place this topic within a framework of disempowerment. You argue that the Muslim community are disempowered. Explain that idea to me, please.
Well, I think what it is that we are profoundly disempowered by our general belief that modernity is universal and neutral. So it's not specifically Western. Now, of course, everyone knows that it is Western in historical genesis. Yeah. It took place as a result of particular changes and crystallized in the post-Enlightenment period, and then you have the Industrial Revolution, and then colonialism, and it spreads around the world. Yeah. But there's this fundamental belief that somehow that particularity, just like every other civilization is particular, has been transcended somehow. Somehow it's become universal. Right. You'll find in the book that there are several authors. One of them is V.S. Naipaul, for example, who has a very famous article on the universal civilization, which he identifies with Western modernity. And he says, sure, there is a colonial past there. There is this Eurocentrism. There is this racism, and that still causes pain. But that's all in the past. It became universal at a particular point. It became the property of all of mankind. And I think what disempowers the Muslims is this false belief that something which is profoundly idiosyncratically Western is in fact universal and neutral. So what do I mean by saying, one might say that's a genetic fallacy. Who cares if it's Western? Just because we find out where it comes from doesn't mean that there's something wrong with it. Right. And of course, look, there isn't in every way something wrong with it. This is the world that we live in, the air we breathe, and as we'll find out, as one will find out in the course of reading the book, and I'm sure will come out in our conversation today, I'm not in any way advocating bashing the West or hoping that it disappears or not partaking in life in the West and so on. What disempowers us is this belief that modernity is universal and neutral, when modernity developed in order to provide solutions for very idiosyncratic tensions that afflicted Christian civilization in Europe in the late Middle Ages, and specifically the Renaissance, the Reformation, that led to the emergence of what we call early modernity.
Yeah, so when we talk about modernity, what are we really talking about here? I mean, I would imagine that many people, when they hear the word modernity, they think the iPhone, technology, science, progress, AI. How do you understand modernity?
Yeah, I'm not advocating that we all become Luddites.
We move to the farm or agricultural communities, right?
Yeah. I mean, with provisos, that's not quite what I'm advocating at all.
Yeah.
So yes, exactly. What I was saying was leading directly onto your question, which is what is modernity?
Yeah.
Now, there's an ambiguity just on a very basic level in the word modern, because modern can mean at least two things. For our purposes here, two things. Yeah. One is just the people who happen to be alive right now are modern. So if they were alive in the late 19th century, they would have been modern. And if they were alive in the 15th century, they would have been modern.
Yeah.
A lot of the times when people hear you talking about modernity and they're puzzled, they're like, what's your problem with us being alive right now? And that's really not what it is at all. Modernity is a specific, particular philosophy, just like every other philosophy is. So you have the philosophy of modernity. Yeah. It has specific commitments. It's a specific ideology. What it basically means is the rejection of authority, the rejection of traditional God-centered, a traditional God-centered hierarchical view of the cosmos, of being, right? So typically in both the Islamic world and the Christian world, just to take these two examples, I mean, I don't want to, that's enough, I think, for us to deal with those two very broad examples. Mm-hmm. Typically this is really a theophanic understanding, which is that the world is in some sense reveals the presence of God. Nature reveals the presence of God. We have in Islam the concept of the ayat, the ayat in the cells rather, and on the horizons.
These are signs.
These are signs, right, by which we move in our heart, in our intellect, from the physical phenomena, as we call it today, to the underlying metaphysical reality.
Right.
And this idea that on those horizons, in ourselves, we acquire through the fitrah, through the, our pure original disposition, knowledge of aesthetical judgments, what is the beautiful, knowledge of moral judgments, what is the good, and knowledge of metaphysical truths, right? What is the true? What is true about, what is the fundamental nature of this existence? Now, what modernity involves, and again, I'll have to kind of condense it here because it can only come out, I think, when we talk about the 5 bifurcations in detail. But what it basically involves is, at a certain point in European history, a point of crisis was reached where it didn't seem possible to any longer believe in that theophanic, unified vision of existence. Right. And so you have several ruptures, very, very cataclysmic events, like the Protestant Reformation, like the 30 Years' War that followed, in which 4 million Europeans died. It's by far the largest loss of life until you have the mechanized warfare of the 20th century. Yes. And suddenly Europe is rent in two. And this, what it fundamentally involves is a rejection of the old Catholic order. Right. And this new focus on the individual as the ultimate arbiter of truth when it comes to metaphysical matters. And really the broad idea that we are cut off from the metaphysical fundamentally, except through pure faith. And all we can really hope to know is the physical world, and particularly insofar as it's knowable through the scientific method. And so you have the scientific revolution following on very quickly from the Protestant Revolution, but we'll get to that when we come to it. But essentially, it's a split, obviously can be summed up as the secular split, where all of our social formations, our social organization, our political structures, even our understanding of ethics, are now all carried out systematically without reference to revelation or metaphysics. We are now self-enclosed, right, in this world. We don't need anything outside of it or beyond it.
I mean, Hasan, we have a lot of non-Muslims who listen to and watch our show, and they will be surprised that you find that to be contentious. I mean, in the modern world, there is this assumption that we can't connect all of our life all of our life's problems to a metaphysical reality. We can't say that, there needs to be, God needs to participate in our daily lives, in our political affairs, in our social affairs, in what we call justice, in our moral understanding. Fine, we may have some moral codes that guide us, but fundamentally that connection should be severed, because when it was present in Europe and maybe other parts of the world, it stifled creativity, it stifled progress. I mean, what's your retort to that?
Well, it's definitely multifaceted. I would say, first of all, yes, I'm arguing from a very, very marginal position.
Right.
And when you're arguing from a very, very marginal position, it's sometimes difficult to communicate what you mean to people, because you're challenging the air that they breathe. You're challenging, it's like Nietzsche said, we cannot see it because it has been victorious. Because this worldview of modernity has been so triumphantly successful everywhere, questioning it is very, very difficult. It's like questioning something so fundamental that you've never noticed it's there before, and it's almost difficult to countenance. Now, but why is this so important and in reality not a marginal view at all? Well, it's because everything which was bifurcated and severed in the West, including this broad secular split we've been describing, remained whole in the Islamic world right until the end.
End being 20th century.
Well, right until, it differs depending on the place. I mean, there are convenient dates one can give, Indian Mutiny, end of the Caliphate. There are various, and it's impossible to give a particular date.
Right.
And it's not that everything has completely disappeared.
Sure.
And of course, there are many things to discuss about that, and kind of almost infinity of details about the precise status of that traditional worldview in the Muslim world. That's to a large degree what the book is about, because many of the most passionate and committed advocates of this universal, neutral, scientific civilization are Muslims within Muslim countries.
Right.
And I think that is more than anything else what the book is trying to tackle. But what I'd say is that yes, we grow up. I mean, speaking to the Western interlocutor, non-Muslim perhaps interlocutor that you were referring to, I think it's just realizing that what we think is just the way the world is actually a very specific philosophical choice that we have inherited. We haven't usually thought about very much. Most of that stuff about, well, human flourishing, social mobility, creativity, all that stuff, it didn't exist in the medieval world. Most of that is Protestant propaganda, which has been very successful for hundreds of years.
Right.
There are many studies, and one can Google this, which show definitively there was more social mobility in the Middle Ages in Europe than there is today. So, and there are many of the assumptions that we make are simply not true. But I think where we'd get to the meat of this is when we talk about the 5 bifurcations, or the severances, or the splits, you might say, which forms the main explanatory kind of means of analysis in this book. I think there we'd be able to kind of bring out details of exactly how it's not tenable to look at modernity as universal and neutral. It was a choice. It could well never have happened. And it was very much, and it didn't happen outside of Europe.
Right.
And why did it not happen? It's because those very specific tensions that existed quite uniquely in Europe, mostly in virtue of the nature of Christianity and the absence of Islam, didn't exist elsewhere. And so it's a very much an anachronistic, out of proper chronology, and anatopistic, out of proper place phenomenon for the Muslim world to simply blithely accept all of these Western cultural products as if they are neutral.
But it begs the question, if Islam was so successful in creating a type of society that innovated and that had progress and that produced culture and civilization and science, then why did we leave all of that and embrace a Western modernity? Like, what's the cause behind that embrace in the first place?
Beautiful question. It's summed up by a quotation by Mustafa Sabri, the last Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam, in his 3-volume work, Mawqif al-Aql, which was written in the 50s, and it's a critique of modernity and critique of Islamic modernism, all sorts of amazing things. He says, we in the Muslim world mistook a martial victory for an intellectual victory.
Right.
So we assumed, because we've been defeated militarily, they must have everything right. It's so overwhelming, this defeat. It's so crushing for our spirit. It's so difficult for our pride. We need to catch up. We've fallen behind. Whereas, yes, there's no doubt, the Western world developed scientifically. Again, we tend to think of science as neutral. There's a sense in which it is. There's another sense in which it's absolutely not. And this is something that we'll discuss when we get to the severance of knowing subject and nature. But what it basically involves is, at a certain point in the mostly 17th century, in the scientific revolution, the West turned from a view of nature, decisively turned away from the previously dominant view of nature, which is more largely shared by the Islamic world, as a theophany of God's nature, by which we come to know of his nature, signs. The fundamental purpose of the study of nature in that worldview, in that framework, is to get us closer to God, closer to knowledge of God.
Right.
Yes, there is a place for practical contrivances and technology, but it's not a central place. What changes is a shift from the view of nature as theophanic, as revealing the divine, to a view of nature as simply so much raw material, as Brad Gregory puts it, awaiting the imprint of our desires.
Right.
As in, science is about the mastery of nature, the exploitation of nature. We don't care what it is. We don't care what spiritual reality it has. We don't care about any of that. That's all subjective. That's all your belief. You're welcome to it. But the real world is us exploiting nature and making lots of money.
Right.
So, that's a bit of a...
No, it's very useful. Before we get to your 5 bifurcations, that, in a sense, I think that's the meat of your argument. How much, so we've said secularism almost underpins modernity, this division between, human life and God, and we will come to that. Would you place liberalism, even Marxism, within this broad label of modernity?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah, both of them.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, what you're arguing, and I suppose we'll come to this, is that Muslims have to reject these ideologies because they're not universal. They're very particular to a Western experience, in particular, a Western experience of religion.
Exactly.
So let's then talk about these bifurcations or severances, as you call them, or separations, because I think they're really, really fascinating. So the first bifurcation you talk about in your great book is the division between sacred law and spirit. Explain that to me, please.
Okay, so one of the most characteristic aspects of Pauline Christianity, right? Of course, Paul of Tarsus is this disciple of Jesus's, except he's not. He never met Jesus, or Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. But I'll say Jesus because we're talking in the context of the contemporary Christian view of everything we're discussing. He never met Jesus, and he was, of course, a Jew who, before he became a Christian, was actually persecuting the church quite avidly. He was a major antagonist and enemy of the early church. And on the road to Damascus, he purports to have had a vision where Jesus invited him to join his church, and he became a Christian, having had this charismatic experience, this mystical experience. And without getting into too many of the details of his life, he departed from the Christianity of the actual disciples of Jesus in Jerusalem. And this is even recounted in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, by wanting to bring the dawah, as it were, the message of Christianity to the Gentiles, whereas Jesus, even in the Gospel, says that he was only sent to the lost sheep of the children of Israel, right? Just as indeed the Quran says of him, just as indeed Islam says of him, that he was only sent to the Jewish people with his message. And the key aspect of this is that Paul said, the law is abrogated. We don't need to ask new converts to follow the law. It's been abrogated by Christ crucified. Christ's sacrifice, where he takes away our sins, and through that act of belief in him, that pure grace, it's abrogated the law. The law was this curse on us. He even uses that word because we could never live up to it. We had to follow every jot and tittle, as indeed Jesus says in the Gospels, or every fine detail. I mean, that's the King James Version, jot and tittle. Every fine detail of the law must be adhered to. He says, well, that's impossible. You can't even do it in principle. So it's this curse, the law. Jesus has come to abrogate the law, and the new dispensation is based on this leap of faith in Christ and this affective, personal relationship with the crucified Christ. What has this led to? It's led to an inability to understand that in Islam we have a Sharia, and to a certain extent in Judaism, but in Islam we have the Sharia, which is we understand as sanctifying. It's not this kind of obsessive compulsive list of things that we have to worry about all the time. Oh God, it's something that allows us to get closer to God in every scenario, in every object, in every action. Yes. Right? It's a detailed, revealed law. Christianity, Pauline Christianity, doesn't have that. It doesn't have this understanding that you follow a detailed law which governs every aspect of your life.
Right.
Right. And so there's this disconnect, and there's this sense not only that they don't need to go together, the revealed law and the spirit, but they're somehow really opposed to one another.
Really.
The spiritual life is exactly not adhering to a law.
Yeah.
That's because this world is fundamentally self-contained. I mean, I'm bringing in a little bit of Lutheranism here. I should probably save that to the faith and reason split. But the basic idea is God hasn't revealed a detailed plan for every single action, every single item. Is it halal? Is it haram? And so on. Right. And that's not what would save us anyway. That's an outdated understanding of religion. What saves us is simply that faith in Christ crucified.
Yeah.
And that is the litmus test. That is that is what is soteriologically, I think I said that right.
Yeah.
Soteriology. It means the salvation, the nature of salvation.
Yeah.
What brings about salvation. And for them, it's not adherence to a revealed law. It's simply the act of belief in Christ. And as would later, it's not just Christ crucified, but it's Christ, when the incarnate God crucified. So it becomes even more significant and momentous. God himself, only is only purported to come into the flesh once, at one particular moment in history. Yeah. If you miss that, you're in trouble.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting. So because it is the case that we come across Muslims over time today, I suppose now you're packaging it, you're explaining it in the context of the supremacy, I suppose, of modernity upon our lives, who argue that, who almost underplay the role of Sharia and claim that the Sharia is not really important in our lives. And what is important are these overarching spiritual claims that a Muslim needs to subscribe to.
Exactly.
Okay, so in a sense, you're saying that comes originally from Christianity, and modernity universalizes that way of thinking.
Absolutely. What I'm also saying is it is the first chronologically in these series of bifurcations.
Right.
So one thing leads to another.
Right.
Yes, exactly as you say. It's a very insightful point, because who are those Muslims who are advocating what you're saying?
Yeah.
They're the modernists,
Right.
usually. So that's very significant. It's because of precisely what we're discussing. Yeah. But more immediately, the relevance of the split between law and spirit is that it leads directly on to the other bifurcations and informs them.
I'm going to be terribly unkind and ignorant here in a way, but I often hear people say, no, that's a Sufi way of thinking, separating the sacred law from the spirit. We have a lot of non-Muslims who may come into Islam through Sufism.
That's true.
So explain the Sufi perspective on this matter.
Yeah, that's the exact diametrical opposite of the truth. But you're absolutely right. That is a common conception today. And I suppose that's for any number of reasons. I think very much it's to do with, as you said, these fundamentally Christian conceptions of the fundamental split between law and spirit. They've got nothing to do with each other. You don't need law if you've got spirit. Yeah. And simply informing the modern mindset, whether someone's a Muslim or a non-Muslim. And then when people want to make Islam on a dawah level more attractive to spiritually minded Muslims, they say, well, here you've got Sufism where you don't need the law, because that's the spiritual aspect. Yeah. If there's a mystical aspect, it must be antinomian, right? Whereas that just doesn't follow in our context. But I think that's just a basic assumption they make, that if there's a mystical path, it must be antinomian. Right. It must be opposed to the law. It's the total opposite of the truth. The conception in Sufism is that Sharia and Haqiqah, so revealed law or sacred law, and spiritual reality are absolutely inseparable and complementary. Yeah. You can't have one without the other, without one being incomplete and having something wrong with it. So in order to regulate and provide solid foundations for one's ubudiyya, one's servanthood to God, which is the ultimate purpose of Sufism on one important level, one has to adhere, one has to have that submission to the detailed law. Right. One can't just say, well, I'm so spiritual, I don't need to pray anymore because I'm already seeing God. Yeah. No, that's part of our ubudiyya, part of our servanthood and submission to God. And then the other way around, a detailed adherence to the law while forgetting that it's God that you're worshipping, that's not very good either. Yeah. So I think that would be the basic Sufi understanding.
And just to, I know we want to go into all 5 of the bifurcations, but I find this really interesting because you do find that a number of non-Muslims and Muslims who come back into the faith, they embrace this version of Sufism to the degree, as you said, that they downplay the Sharia. But then they cite Imam Ghazali, for example, as someone who rejected, at the age of 40 or in midlife, he rejected the Sharia and he placed the spiritual side of his spirit to be of a higher value. Is that a misreading of Ghazali?
That's very much a misreading of al-Ghazali, but I can understand how that narrative can take hold. And it's because what Imam al-Ghazali critiques are precisely what we were just discussing, which are the fuqaha, or those who are, well, would you say the doctors of law, or those who are engage legal scholars in the most basic sense. Yeah. Legal scholars, he's critiquing legal scholars who have lost sight of the spiritual reality, which is the whole telos, the whole purpose, the whole underlying motivation for engaging in a detailed study of the sacred law. And so his critique is that because they lose sight of the spiritual reality and what it's all for, they fall into worldliness. And even though it has, it presents itself as deen and fiqh and all this stuff, it actually becomes worldly for them, purely worldly. And so that's really what he's critiquing. But he's absolutely not opposed to the Sharia in any way. And in fact, he's quite to the contrary, of course, on every level. But incidentally, he's also one of the most important Shafi'i scholars in history. Of course, one of the 4 schools of Islamic law. He's one of the 4 or 5 most important Shafi'i scholars of them all.
Great. Your second severance, or bifurcation of modernity is the separation of temporal power and sacred power. Yeah, explain that to me.
So Jesus in the Gospels is supposed to have said, "Render unto Caesar such things as are Caesar's, and render unto God such things as are God's." Now, I'm not in a position to say, did Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam actually speak these words or not? And I don't think anyone really is. And we have to suspend judgment on that. And is there a legitimate way of interpreting that from a Muslim perspective, from an Islamic perspective, from an authentic Islamic perspective? Very possibly. But let's look at the actual impact that it had on subsequent Western civilization.
Yeah.
This is fundamentally the secular principle. And it plays out and gets lots of people in lots of trouble throughout the Middle Ages, lots of conflicts between popes and princes, and we'll mention one in just a moment. And it then, with Luther, with the Treaty of Augsburg and the Peace of Westphalia, and the aftermath of the religious wars, and then trying to actually theorize about tolerance of the religious other and so forth, and Locke and so on, then it finally crystallizes into secularism proper. But what it basically means is, unlike in the Islamic world, where you have a single Sharia, detailed law, which encompasses the political, which binds prince and king and temporal power and the ulama alike, you simply don't have the problems that arise in the West because of this split between temporal power and sacred power. So what it basically amounts to is the fact that you have a pope who possesses the ultimate authority on spiritual matters. And he doesn't have a detailed Sharia because there isn't one. He's arbitrarily the authority.
Right.
It's him. What's his criterion? Being the Pope.
Right.
Whatever he says, that is the actual fact of the matter when it comes to religious doctrine, spiritual reality, and so on. Now, the princeling, the prince, the king, is under the Pope on the spiritual level because he's a Catholic. So he's under the Pope's spiritual authority. But render unto Caesar such things as are Caesar's. So the temporal ruler has jurisdiction when it comes to temporal matters. However, because they're not governed by a Sharia that is binding on them both, you have this series of hugely disruptive disputes throughout the Middle Ages between the Pope and the temporal powers that be. Just one example is the 14th century dispute between Pope Boniface and King Philip the Fair of France. Now, this is one of the most famous of these disputes, these secular disputes, or what would later come to be known as secularism. What took place is that Pope Boniface wanted his clergy in France to be exempted from all taxation because they're clergy. He didn't want to be subject to taxation by the King of France, and he told the King of France as much. We're not going to be taxed.
Yes.
Right? We are exerting our spiritual authority, and it's, we must not be taxed because, we are the spiritual authority and we have a special status. And he was hoping that King Philip was just going to go along with this. But unfortunately for Pope Boniface, Philip was having absolutely none of it. And he said, no, I'm not going to exempt under any circumstances. And of course, you have to imagine the Catholic Church has immense wealth. This is a huge source of tax revenue for him. It makes a difference. So Pope Boniface issues a very, very famous papal bull called Unum Sanctum. It's a very famous document in the history of secularism, as I suppose we'd rather anachronistically call it, and of the Catholic Church and of Western civilization writ large. And in that document, Boniface asserts the papal authority over even the temporal powers. On most occasions, we're fine to leave the temporal powers to their own business and get on with it, but there are questions like this where we actually do have ultimate authority over you. And what he tries to do is he tries to invoke the hierarchy of being, and, we actually are, our hierarchy of the church is reflective of the hierarchy of the angels, and we actually do metaphysically have power over you, so you better listen. And he's invoking there the Dionysius, the Areopagite, his account of hierarchy and metaphysical hierarchy. I've written about this particular episode in this book, but also in my other book, Hierarchy and Freedom, where specifically about unum sanctum in that book. And, the Pope was hoping that this would be an end to it, and he'd be tax exempt. What happened is King Philip decided instead that, I think we'll just kidnap Pope Boniface then.
Yes.
And they kidnapped him and took him away to a castle and said, no, it's not going to happen. You've got to pay your taxes.
Right.
And Pope Boniface, a few days later, actually died of the shock, unfortunately. So that's just one episode in, many, many episodes in the history of this tension between the secular powers and the sacred powers. There's a similar thing at play in the assassination of Archbishop Becket in the cathedral at Canterbury. That's one other major violent dispute between the Pope, the Church, and the King. And then, of course, you have what takes place in the English Reformation between King Henry VIII and the Pope, and that leads to a huge rupture, which again is one of the things that is discussed in the book. So there's always been this tension, and what it ultimately leads to is this understanding that these two domains have to be kept strictly separate.
The temporal and the sacred.
The temporal and the sacred. Right. And the sacred is ultimately going to become something just as it is today.
Personalized.
It's personalized. You don't talk about it in public. It's not polite. It's embarrassing. We protect your right to engage in that, but it's a personal choice and you keep it at home.
How important was the development of Protestantism in the 16th century to the secularism process? Because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if we're talking about the personalizing of faith, then Protestantism lends itself to
very much
to a personalized faith more so than Christianity with the melding of temporal and sacred power. Is that a fair reading of Christian history?
I think very much so. Yeah. I think one of the things that lends itself to secularism as it develops in Protestantism is the fact that Luther, what he does, he's very big on this render unto Caesar thing.
Right.
He's very into obeying the temporal authorities.
Yeah.
And the settlement, what actually saves the day for Luther is that the local prince becomes a Lutheran.
Oh, right.
He protects Luther. The settlements which bring the terrible strife between Catholic and Protestant to an end, Augsburg and Westphalia, are all about saying, we respect, we will tolerate, we will not wage war on, we will protect the rights of subjects within a polity as long as they follow the religious choice of their ruler. So he can become a Lutheran or he can become a Catholic, and this will become a Lutheran land, and this will remain a Catholic land, and we will enter into a treaty of peace on that basis of respecting that, that the religion of the people is to follow the religion of the ruler. Now you can see that is a relativizing factor to a large extent. It's no longer relevant which of them is true. We have a political settlement which is fundamentally prudential and pragmatic.
Right.
And this gives rise to in it contributes in large part to the birth of this conception of the nation state, the sovereign nation state, which has a national church and has a national religion, and this tradition is kept in the line of succession of the kings, that this is a Lutheran country, or this is an Anglican country in the case of England, or this is a Catholic country.
Brilliant.
So, this is very much a consequence to a large extent of the Protestant Reformation. Absolutely.
So I want to ask you about that, because 1648 is the Treaty of Westphalia, and according to some Western historians, that's sort of the birthplace of the nation state. And you've explained that very well, that now the writ of a centralized church is torn apart, and it's really now up to each individual principality and to define their religious complexion, and there should be non-interference between states. So is the nation-state project then intertwined with this project of modernity? Can we add nation-state to this bucket? And if so, is there something particular about the nation-state that Islam would be antagonistic towards?
Absolutely. And I think it's very much bound up with what we've just been discussing. Nationalism involves making the ultimate criterion for identity, for collective identity, a particular ethnic background, a particular geographic situatedness and context and location. And this in many ways has proved to be a replacement for religion, but it's antithetical to Islamic conceptions of our fundamental, brotherhood and sisterhood. Ummah, exactly. We are all from Adam, and Adam is from clay. There's no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, except through taqwa. And this was played out throughout Islamic history, and one of the saddest, I think, departures from this, and this is very relevant to the context that we're talking about, is the nationalism that you now see, and it's been some time, some decades now, emerging in some places close to a century, emerging in the Muslim world. For example, in Turkey, where you have this very, very strong sense of Turkish identity and nationalism, to the extent that if someone's Bosnian or Albanian, they will tend to hide it because it will lead to a kind of lower social status and suspicion and so on. Whereas in the Ottoman world, no one knew who was Arab or this or that or Albanian or Balkan or Turkish. And it's not that it was completely unknown, but it was not a significant factor at all.
Right.
And it's true that in the later Ottoman period, there were, because of the infiltration of certain Western ideas, there were various nationalist movements. That's why Sultan Abdul Hamid, for example, made sure to get an Arab Sheikh al-Islam, because he really wanted to aim towards Islamic unity. He wanted to just break that because he could see that it was a cancer.
Right.
So absolutely, I think that nationalism is very, very much bound up with the identitarian understanding that there is self-creation of identity. It doesn't reflect a transcendent reality. It will basically fundamentally be based on political realities. And so, because the fundamental reality is the political, then we're going to define our identity as a collectivity in terms of that political framework, which is very specific. It's the nation and so on.
I know we're still on our second bifurcation or severance, but I'm fascinated by all of this because it's putting together a lot of discrete ideas in my mind. So thank you very much for that. So liberalism, commonly it's known that John Locke developed the idea or the basic contours of this ideology of liberalism. So how important was what you've just discussed so far, the severance of sacred law and spirit and temporal power and sacred power? How important were these events or these formations to the development of liberalism as an idea?
They're immensely important, very, very important, of the absolute utmost importance. And again, this is very relevant to the non-transferability of liberalism to anywhere outside of Europe, and it's just anachronistic and anatopistic. It's one of my new favorite words. I managed to say it correctly twice now. Yeah. So it's not possible to import liberalism elsewhere, and when you try it, it doesn't work.
Right.
Now, it's basically for the following reason. Liberalism was, in its inception, meant to provide a larger, neutral societal framework for different Christian denominations to exist together in that neutral domain. And religion has become a private affair. It's blind faith. It's a leap of faith. It's, the individual with his subjectivity, with his translated Bible. And it's something that one keeps to oneself. It's such a source of dissension when it's brought outside and claims are made. And so we've moved beyond that now, these interminable theological debates which can't be resolved even in principle. Again, it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy to say they can't be resolved, because one of Luther's great moves, as we'll find out when it comes to severance number 3, faith and reason, was to say, reason, human rationality, has nothing to do with theology. Never. Right. It can't resolve anything. It's afflicted by original sin, just like the accursed natural world is as well. He's a bit negative, Luther. And so this has been one of the great tricks of the devil in the Catholic order, that Aristotle was brought in and everything was highly rationalized. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that these debates are interminable. But the point is, they were, in practice, interminable, and they were causing immense dissension. So the general, and of course we're talking very broad strokes here because we're covering lots of history, but the general approach in early modernity, post-Reformation, was faith becomes a personal thing, right? Liberalism provides the framework in which different Christian denominations can coexist peacefully. So it's a step above just saying you're going to be whatever religion your ruler happens to be. It's saying we could actually have different Christian denominations here. Now, it was very limited, as you know. For John Locke, that didn't include Catholics. No Catholics and no atheists at that point. Now, I have often said and thought that it makes perfect sense that liberalism ultimately was not able to fulfill its own promise that it would actually be able to genuinely tolerate Muslims. Yeah. And we're seeing that playing out on so many levels today, and really post 9/11 onwards it escalated, and then post Gaza it's become a big thing again. But when you look at the history, this makes perfect sense. Liberalism wasn't created actually to host every species of belief. There had to be a commitment to the severance that made it possible in the first place. The severances that made it possible in the first place, i.e. either Christian or post-Christian, but not Islam. That's completely different. That doesn't make sense. Especially because Islam won't come in and be a polite minority and say we're not actually making claims to the objective truth of Islam. Because what they would like is an Islam which will come and say, well, I'll just be a polite minority with my private faith as well, and get on with, contributing to being a good British citizen, and that's more important to me. I'm more British than this, which is what, many in the Western establishment want Muslims to say. And many Muslims have been very obliging, unfortunately. But I think the reason that liberalism has such trouble really tolerating Islam is because it's a counter-hegemony. Mm-hmm. That's how they really view it. To be fair, that's what it really is.
Good, yeah.
And the only thing that liberalism cannot tolerate is anything which undermines liberalism.
Fantastic. Okay, let's move on. I mean, there's a lot more to discuss
there's a lot more
about
there.
that, but I think we could Inshallah, I think we've almost got 3 or 4 episodes, so inshallah we'll plan in the future. But let's then talk about faith and reason, your third severance. Explain that bifurcation between faith and reason.
Okay, this is very interesting. Massively, the new atheists, which, were Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, all these people, when I was growing up in the early 2000s, they were very, very popular and very, very dominant. They're not mercifully that popular anymore, thank God. But I think that they're a useful case study just in terms of making sense of this split between faith and reason, because it is a historical phenomenon. But what it led to, and this is the test of all these severances, what do they lead to? This fundamental shaping of the basic assumptions of the average man and woman in the street. Now, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris were actually completely inept philosophically and theologically. And many people, to give them credit, many excellent books came out and showed this. But they were able to gain many committed followers, to take a lot of people along with them in their argument, because they got you to accept their basic premise. Now, I didn't accept that premise. You wouldn't have accepted that premise. You only go along with someone's argument if you haven't stopped at the first hurdle and said, oh, I didn't accept that premise that you started with. I'm not going to go along with you to your conclusion. That premise was, religious faith is blind faith. You may as well believe in a pink elephant on Venus. You might say, this person's religion is that there exists an all-powerful pink elephant, or very powerful at least, on Venus, and that's their religion. We have to respect that because we're liberal. It's nonsense, It's nonsense, as with all religious beliefs, but we respect it. Because, we're tolerant. We'll let everyone believe whatever silly nonsense they want, as long as they don't try and impose it on us.
Right.
So basically, this conception of faith as necessarily blind faith is something that, let's say, it passes, although I hate using this term because there's no such thing, but it passes the average person in the street test. It's basic common knowledge and basic common wisdom, and that is because of fundamentally the split between, which is a consequence of the split between knowing subject and nature, the split between the humanities and the hard sciences. Right. The only real binding knowledge we can have is of that which is empirical, or rooted directly in the empirical. And everything else at the end of the day is just subjective interpretation, and it has no real evidence for it. And this is what enabled the Dawkins and others of this world to make so much headway, because people were going along with this completely false initial premise. But this is the difficulty. If you play into common assumptions, you can make a lot of progress. It's all false.
Can you explain that initial premise succinctly? Are you arguing that the premise is that religious dogma can never be reasoned, and that's their premise?
Yeah. So this comes from a bifurcation of knowing subject and nature. And if we would say more broadly, knowing subject, which is, the individual self-consciousness, self-awareness, inward universe, the knowing subject who knows the world, and then instead of nature, more broadly, you could just say the extramental, whatever is real outside of our minds, this fundamental split between the two. That the real properties in the extramental world are the properties that the scientific revolution of the 17th century decided are really there. And they're actually a very questionable list. And the historical reality is that list was arrived at not so much because they're saying that is what's really there in nature, as because they were saying this is a methodological choice we're making, because treating nature in that way is more conducive to producing technology, to mastering nature, right? To exploiting nature, to harnessing nature to our purposes. Descartes is very explicit about this. Galileo is very explicit, and that's obviously another split. I think we're still on the faith and reason one here. They're all related to each other. So this is again something we simply take for granted. Well, surely that's true. Well, in fact, the very methodological division, the choice to separate hard sciences, which are supposed to pertain in some sense to the empirical world, and the humanities, let's call them, which are all ultimately fundamentally subjective. They're not really binding. You can have someone who's more sophisticated or less sophisticated, but even the really sophisticated person, he's not really getting at objective reality because it's not knowable even in principle. Okay? That very methodological choice that there's humanities and there's hard sciences is not itself an empirical judgment. It's not itself empirical judgment. The experience we have of aesthetic judgments is something beautiful, right? Is an experience, just as much of our experience as of a sensible object is an experience, right? Our experience of, let's say, seeing, sorry for the horrible image, but seeing someone deliberately run over an old lady in the street, God forbid, as opposed to seeing someone flying across the road to save the person saving them, the feeling that we have, the ethical judgment that that is good and the other one is evil, is just as much an experience as our experience of the empirical object. Our metaphysical sense that underlying all of the phenomena, there is a unity which gives meaning to it all, which is beyond time, that we are moving towards that reality, we come from that reality, as in our intuition of the divine, is an experience just as much as that empirical one. By what right and on what empirical basis, what empirical object tells me that this is real science and all of that is just subjective? There's no empirical experience. It's not itself an empirical judgment. That is where metaphysics comes in. That is a metaphysical judgment. And pre-modernity, in the Islamic world, obviously that goes up all the way up until early 20th century, and it's still retained to some extent, but not with a very great degree of intelligibility. Right. And in the Christian world up to 16th, 17th century, and still kind of the flag was still held aloft by some traditionalist Catholics right the way to the end. So there is continuity. But what they shared in common is this understanding of the human sciences as all interrelated, and the physical sciences not having a privileged status, and the idea that you can apply logic and very precise modes of reasoning to nonsensible questions just as much as to empirical questions.
So questions like the existence of God.
The existence of God, objective morality, objective aesthetical judgments, and what everything that the 20th century, early 20th century positivists in the Vienna Circle, for example, would have called literally nonsense, because they don't refer to any empirical reality. And guess what? Exactly the same thing happened to them, to what I just described about the humanities hard sciences split. They realized, hold on, our own verification principle, which says that all true knowledge must have an empirical reference, that very sentence, all true knowledge must have an empirical reference. Where's the empirical reference? And that was literally, I mean, it's simplifying it a bit, but that was basically the way that positivism was decisively discredited. So this is, again, it's the air we breathe. We just tend to think of, you know, the hard sciences are objective and everything else is not. But that is purely a theory. Choice presupposes a very idiosyncratic history, and it's not at all what our tradition has ever thought. I challenge anyone to give me an Islamic thinker who has ever thought that, who is not, you know, who's obviously pre-modernity, who's prior to any influence from Western post-Enlightenment modernity.
So you've covered your third and fourth severance bit. Is there anything more to be said about a knowing subject and nature idea, or should we move on?
I think we should do a little bit more on that, because it's really, really important. It's about this issue of the neutrality of science.
Yeah.
The you know, modern science is extraordinary. It's produced amazing technology. I don't advocate people stopping using it. I can't live without it personally. I don't think that most people can either. I think there are very important ways that we can ameliorate some of the very negative impacts that it has, and that's obviously everyone's very familiar with all of that. I'm not in any way advocating becoming a Luddite or whatever, which is another very interesting historical movement, which is actually discussed here. Rage against the machines. But all I'm saying is, it's just a factual matter. Modern science is not neutral. It's not, and what I mean is, it's the set of sciences, of modes of human knowledge which purport to study the nature of the natural world. Well, the way it does it is not neutral. It's not the way that Muslims did it either. It's not the way that Muslims practiced natural science. Now, using the term science is very anachronistic about the Muslim world and very anatopistic. And it's the same even of the Western world until very recently. This was called natural philosophy. The word science came in very, very late. There's a few faculties, I think in Aberdeen or something, where they still call it natural philosophy, just because it's a kind of heritage thing. And what does that mean? It means it used to be subordinated to philosophy in their understanding of the manzuma, the tartib, the kind of scheme of the sciences. It had a place that was actually below metaphysics in the ordering of the sciences. It needed metaphysics for its fundamental assumption. So I can prove that it's not neutral in a few sentences. There is a theory choice, a methodological move that is made in the scientific revolution in the guise of things, and these particular things are cited with, from the primary sources in the book, in the scientific revolution, which are common to all of the major thinkers. Francis Bacon, René Descartes, Galileo, and so on. We'll just stay with those three for now. So but of course it encompasses all of them. I mean, you could go on and on and on, and even when the scientific revolution becomes more explicitly philosophical, so you have thinkers like Hobbes and Locke and so on, they all reject final causation and formal causation. Now I'm going to explain these. The Aristotelian understanding of nature that they can't escape from, because that was what was dominant and they were all responding to it and they all know it. And they're all using the language. Recognizes four modes of explanation of nature. They're actually called causes. I mean, it transcends what we call nature, but anyway. We call them the four causes. So they are the efficient cause, the material cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. Okay? So let's take the classic example of a bed that a carpenter's making, because it's just a classic example, and it's very illustrative. So the efficient cause, which brings the thing out of non-existence into existence, the action, is the carpenter, right? The material cause are the pieces of wood that he uses, the wood. The formal cause is the configuration, the relations of the components. That configuration, which is in his mind before it's out there, there's a plan of it. Exactly how all the parts relate. That very configuration, the aggregate of all the relations, is the form, okay? That's what the thing is. But there's another very important aspect of what the thing is, which is the final cause, the purpose. What is it for? So a bed is for sitting on or sleeping in, right? The carpenter is the efficient cause. He's the one who brings it out of non-existence into existence on a pattern, the form that he has in mind, the idea that he has in mind, which is that specific configuration, and it's all tending towards a purpose, which is the final cause. Now, in traditional science, and this is all the provisos about using the word, science studies all the four causes when it comes to nature. The form is also called the essence of a thing, its innermost nature. Now, we were talking about a man-made object, but things in nature have essences as well. They have forms. Now, those forms, there's human nature. There's the nature of a tree. There's a nature of whatever it happens to be. these are not construable as physical because they are the metaphysical pattern that orders the physical aspects, the empirical properties and so on. And everything in nature has a purpose as well. So a traditional conception of physics as subordinated to metaphysics absolutely took into account the purposes of nature. What are they for? What are they tending towards? So, and that's of course their telos, to use the Aristotelian term. So there was a methodological move. Again, we have the actual original quotation from the primary text in Bacon and Descartes and others. We have this methodological move to explicitly throw out purposes and essences from nature. That's not because they were saying this is objectively true. And this is how it's misunderstood as neutral. They're just saying what reality is really like. They don't know what reality is really like. They've already excluded everything which would make sense of what it is. What are left are the efficient cause and the material cause. That's what the physical sciences should study. The other thing is they have this distinction between, there are many things, but one other important thing is distinction between secondary qualities and primary qualities. And they say all that actually exists in nature are primary qualities, which are purely quantitative. Things like number, figure, solidity, things which can be empirically measurable. And all those other things, which are part and parcel of the experience of a thing, you know, like the colors that make up the world and so on, are, and more or less, everything which is on the level of real quality, as the Aristotelian category, become purely subjective. Those are not actually there in the object. And just as we have in the modern conception, you know, modern science tells us that what's really here is not me and Jalal, but it's all of these fundamental particles and interacting and purely physical properties which are somehow what is real, and we're somehow just kind of parasitic somehow on that. We're what's not really real. Even our consciousness is supposed to be an epiphenomenon of these neurons blindly firing. Funny irony is, how did we find out about that was the case? It's through this epiphenomenon, which is supposed to be parasitic. So the whole idea that somehow consciousness is not real, well, it's only by consciousness that you've been able to say that it's not real. So that's a kind of another paradox. But so, you know, yeah, I mean, that's what is most fundamental to, and this is a forgotten methodological move. And that's never changed. And what was this all in aid of? It was in aid of a mechanistic understanding of nature, which could be manipulated and exploited through the predictive power of mathematical modeling, right? As in, it's not so much they're saying, this is the real nature of nature. It doesn't have purposes or essence. They're saying, for our purposes, we don't want to look at that. No. They're a distraction.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So in a sense, are you arguing there's sort of, you know, it's non-recognition of the metaphysical in modern scientific method is essentially an irrational move. It's an irrational way of looking at the scientific world.
I think it can be rational as long as you acknowledge this is a methodological move I'm making.
Right.
I'm not saying this is the real nature of reality,
right,
but it's a methodological move because I want to produce technology.
Sure.
And construing nature in this way, even if I know that there's more to it than that, is conducive to the production of the development of technology.
Yeah.
The problem I have is when Muslims blithely accept modern science as the ultimate knowledge standard. So, as I say in the book, you have this kind of new priesthood, this kind of fetishization and totemization of modern science and the engineer and the doctor, who become the new kind of high priest of the society. You go to the engineer and the doctor for everything. They will tell you everything because they know everything. Because of the way that the way that modern science has been misconceived. And I think that, unfortunately, in the period of colonialism and colonization, there was not and I don't blame, obviously, I mean, it was not a time where it was possible for thought and philosophy and this type of investigation to necessarily thrive easily, but there was an insufficiently critical appraisal of the nature of modernity when it came in. And I would say that it mostly comes down to what Mustafa Sabri, the last Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam, says: we mistook a martial victory for an intellectual victory. We were just so overwhelmed by being taken over and conquered.
Yeah.
And we felt, well, you know, we need to catch up. One has to remember the imposition of these positivist, and in many cases kind of proto or quasi-liberalist on the political and ethical level conceptions through the imposition of this kind of universalized and really mostly rather third-rate, unfortunately, secular educational system on the Muslim world was absolutely simultaneous with a systematic dismantling of our indigenous alternative,
right, which is Islam.
Which is Islam and our knowledge structures and our knowledge systems. So we don't even have that authentic lens through which to appraise what we're seeing. You're seeing that's been taken away from us at the same time as the alternative has been forced upon us, and we're being told it's neutral.
I mean, it's not surprising then that after the Indian Mutiny, maybe tens of thousands of ulama, of imams were murdered, were executed by the British.
Absolutely.
This is to remove that Islamic knowledge from society.
Very similar thing under Ataturk.
Yeah.
Very similar thing. Yeah.
So your fifth and final bifurcation or severance is a division between metaphysics and morality. Explain that division, please.
Yeah, you might also say, you know, between morality and ontology. What it basically means, and it's, if you'll forgive me for introducing this here, it's what leads to the Gaza genocide, is the idea that ethical frameworks might sound nice, might sound lovely, but at the end of the day, they're subjective. They're not really binding. They're choices, they're faith even. And this has very, very weighty consequences because people are looking at horror, aghast. Why isn't international law binding? Why isn't it being applied? Why is there no mechanism by which it can simply be, those concerned can simply be compelled to abide by its dictates? Well, it's because what is at play is something much more fundamental than the internal structure of international law. International law is based on, in terms of philosophical build-up of propositions, on natural law. That's its historical genesis, Hugh Grotius and all of these key thinkers. And so it exists in this uneasy tension with another dominant philosophical position in Western thought, which is Machiavellianism. I would argue that what is the reality on the ground politically in the Western world today, and when it comes to international relations and international politics and power politics, is Machiavellianism. That's the bottom line.
Explain Machiavellianism to our listeners.
The Machiavellianism is, to put it crudely, might is right. Whatever you need to do in order to achieve your political aims and cement your power, you do. Whatever you need to do.
The absence of morality in the political realm.
Absolutely, the absence of morality in the political realm. The ends justify the means. The ends are subjectively determined. They're basically determined by power interests. And if we're America, we're very moral, so we believe in international law, but then we're not going to apply it because it's actually opposed to our power interests. But we do believe in it, and we are actually very good at moral because we believe in international law and fairness and, you know, an international rules-based system and so on, but we're not going to apply it. We're going to keep on vetoing.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, why? Because if you look at the actual structure of commitment, philosophically, inescapably, it's on a philosophical level. What do we actually believe about the universe? it's might is right, will to power. It's not actually natural law that there are inherent rights that every human being has in virtue of their nature, in virtue of the nature of things, in light of the nature of things. There are intrinsic moral values and judgments which are binding on all human beings. That's what international law has to be based on, because the problem with international law is it transcends the internal positive law of a nation, but then, which is of course binding because of the structure of punishment and of enforcement and so on. So it's binding in that sense. You don't need to invoke natural law. It's binding because you're going to get in trouble and you're going to be punished. But the problem comes when you're faced with the problem of the pluralism of these systems of positive internal law, domestic law, and how are you going to relate to one another? Now, again, the kind of survival of the fittest, might is right to Machiavellianism is going to say, well, if we're more powerful than you, then you will do what we say. Well, that is actually, that is and always has been operative. Just to say finally, there have been, why did all this, why do you have the League of Nations and you have the universal, the Charter of Human Rights, and you have the Nuremberg trials, and you have the
ICC and the ICJ.
All of this.
Rome Statute.
Yeah, I would say somewhat cynically, but I would say that these obtain insofar as you have a Europe and you have a USA and you have a Soviet Union. Obviously, you're playing with different time periods here, but just speak very broadly, which are all real players. They have to be taken in consideration. This is before the total, unipolarization of the world with America. It matters that there's a real power balance, and you have to respect that. And so we're going to have a system of rules-based system in place which can provide this framework within which we're going to have our treaties and we're going to interact and so on. But the reality is, when it comes to a nation that has no real standing and no real position in that game, it doesn't really apply. I don't think it ever has.
It's really interesting. I know we spoke about this in our last conversation, but liberals argue that they've moved beyond that, the Thucydides Melian dialogue, the idea that might is right.
Yeah.
And now we do have something called international humanitarian law, and we do have these moral codes which everyone can subscribe to. Your argument is that at best that's no more than a fig leaf. It's there to pretend that there's a greater cause to the West and its international order, when in reality international law is subservient to this Machiavellian power game.
I would say that natural law, international law, is engaged in a losing battle with Machiavellianism right now. Look, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that no one believes in human rights and they're not sincere, and it doesn't have any reality whatsoever, ever. But you have these moments where the masks come off.
Gaza
you see the real, exactly. You see the real underlying dynamic is not that. That's what they wanted. That's what they wanted us to think. And there's been a lot of steps in that direction, for throughout the history of the last 20 years. And, the war on Iraq was a big moment, and the war on terror, and what took place with the suspension of civil liberties in the UK and the US, and especially directed towards Muslims and all sorts of things. But I think Gaza is the real mask-off moment, the decisive one. And I think it's one which has, with this kind of resurgence is not really the word, with this kind of sudden emergence of what they're calling the global South, is this real force to be reckoned with and that can't be ignored anymore. Simultaneous to this kind of masks-off moment. I think it is a very, very weighty and momentous, significant moment.
Let me ask you about it, because on X you sent out a post where you said October the 7th was a defining event that exposes the terminal moral illegitimacy of the West. Can you elaborate on how October 7th symbolizes this crumbling Western hegemony?
I think there are so many different levels to it. I don't think it's going to be a straightforward process. I don't think that, when I talk about the crumbling of hegemony, there are going to be a lot of twists and turns and ups and downs, and the West is still enormously powerful. I think we can't get kind of lost in this, in the excitement of the moment, because it is significant, but we should kind of constrain ourselves to its actual significance. I think its actual significance is the breakdown of the post-1945 kind of moral narrative and universe, which is basically the Western world triumphed over evil, the ultimate embodiment of evil, which was Nazism. Nazism was kind of pure evil, and this is, embodied by, epitomized by the concentration camps, and, the war was waged in order to liberate the concentration camps and to save the Jews and to instantiate human rights, and that was what it was all about. It was, it was a just war, and, one of the few truly just wars, because they were fighting this absolute epitome of evil. And then in the Nuremberg trials afterwards, we had to say never again. So we instantiated this system of international law and accountability and so on, and we put them on trial. Now, look, let's just start with two things which are wrong with that narrative. First of all, the Second World War wasn't waged in order to save the Jews. It wasn't waged in order to liberate the concentration camps. Yes. In fact, Jewish refugees were systematically sent home.
Turned away,
Turned away in their boats, still on their boats, when obviously the Nazi persecution of the Jews had become a reality, and had become to a certain extent known and was being reported in the Western media at the outset of the war and so on. There was a deliberate policy of turning the Jews away, although it was known that they were facing severe dangers. Now, one other thing is the Nuremberg trials. Did you notice them putting Churchill and Bomber Harris and Roosevelt? Well, Roosevelt had just died. But did you notice them putting themselves on trial for the firebombing of Hamburg, for the firebombing of Dresden, for the obliteration of hundreds of other German towns completely gratuitously, because they weren't even military targets? And of course, it came out after the war. It was by whatever process, but it was eventually made public, the documents which showed that this was deliberate policy. This actually was terror bombing. It was deliberate terror bombing. The firebombing of Tokyo, the nuking of Hiroshima. They weren't put on trial under international law for these crimes, these atrocities. And so, nonetheless, we're brought up with this narrative that the Second World War was this just war. Another thing is that when it comes to the concentration camps, the Allied powers knew about the concentration camps long before they were liberated. They never got rid of them. They never bombed them. They never put a stop to it. And of course, all of the details of what came to be known in the 1970s as the Holocaust, and I don't for a moment deny huge atrocities and indeed a Holocaust which was perpetrated against the Jews, but this was not known during the period of the war in any way. So the moral narrative that has come down to us, that this was fundamentally fighting ultimate, absolute evil of Hitler, is just not accurate in any way. That wasn't, Hitler was the one who was trying to make peace with Britain consistently throughout, especially in 1940, and those attempts were all rebuffed. He actually wanted, as is absolutely establish a mainstream history, wanted to make peace with the British, especially because of his admiration for the British Empire. So I'm not denying that Hitler was evil. He was an evil man. But Churchill was an evil man. He, very likely played an instrumental role in the Bengal famine, which killed 4 million people. He was the man behind the firebombing, even when Harris, who was very enthusiastic about it as well, we're talking about February 1945, the Germans have lost. Churchill pushes him, no, we're going to flatten Dresden, we're going to kill tens of thousands of people. Of course, we don't know the real numbers of, non-military target civilians, just, for the terror of it, break civilian morale. So, the point is, all of these inconsistencies in the actual narrative are not generally known. They're becoming much better known now in the last 5-10 years. But certainly the narrative that has dominated post-1945 about, the liberal West saved the world and it was just such a wonderful thing. Sure, Nazism was a terrible thing, but the slave trade, the African slave trade, colonialism, all of the outrages of the colonial period, the genocide of the Native Americans, this is all post-Enlightenment liberal civilization. So, this narrative of light and darkness, we're all brought up in it. I used to believe it, even though I was brought up in a very, very committed and spiritually committed and religiously committed Muslim family. But, I had a Western schooling in an ordinary state school. I was brought up to believe that as well. I used to feel, burst with pride when I saw a documentary about the Battle of Britain and we saved the world and everything, when in fact, who defeated the Nazis? It was actually the Russians. The role that we played was mostly in the air war, bombing German cities. It was the real...
Ground war, yeah.
Yeah, the real Grand War was totally conducted on the Eastern Front. In any case, the point is, that is the narrative that held for a long, long time. The reality is, Nazism, liberalism, just for want of a better term, and communism, they are all the same, they're different manifestations of the same phenomenon, which is modernity. And you can say that liberal civilization is, let's say, the kind of patron philosophers of the British empiricists, Hume and Locke and these people, Adam Smith and so on. And Nazi Germany was more of a Nietzschean modernity. And of course, the Soviet modernity was more of a Marxist modernity. But these are all ideologues of modernity in this philosophical sense that I'm talking about. I would say that was, as it says in the Quran, "Ba'sahum bainahum shadid." This was a civil war of modernity between. There wasn't a good guy there. It was evil against evil. And of course, I'm not saying on an individual level. I don't believe that my great-grandfather who fought in the Battle of the Somme was evil. But I'm saying in terms of the ideologies which were at play, I don't think that there was a good guy. But what do we grow up with? We grow up with this idea that the West its whole moral claim is based on defeating ultimate evil and freeing the world in the Second World War. Well, it's not true on so many different levels. Finally, the final point on this, the Second World War was, the ostensible cause, the ostensible occasion of the start of the war was protecting the sovereignty of Poland, right? That was the ostensible occasion for declaring war. What happened at the end of the war? The whole of Eastern Europe, including Poland, was given over to an even worse, an arguably even worse, certainly more murderous dictator than Hitler, i.e. Stalin. So, even on that, there are large inconsistencies even on that level. But what is Gaza? Gaza is a live streamed horror that we've all looked at those images and we've wept. We've all looked at those images and we've cried. And we have been deeply hurt by it, deeply affected by it in a way that has never happened before. And the images we're seeing are worse than anything we've ever seen even at Buchenwald or at wherever it happens to be. We've never seen images like that. They have broken the barrier. They've pushed the boundaries of horror, and it's all been live streamed to our phones and the technology that they created. And we know they're in a position to stop this tomorrow.
Yeah.
We know they're in a position to stop this tomorrow. And we know that they're not. And it's calling into question everything that we've ever been taught about the inherent goodness of Western liberalism. It's a masks off moment, and it's a point of no return.
Yeah.
We can't go back after this. You know, look, the Iraq War was a horror, and I happen to know on a very close level people who were able to make me feel what that was really about almost as much as what I know about Gaza, because of the stories and I know the people who died and the direct impact that it had on people. But on this mass level, that's only if you know people. That wasn't live streamed to the world like what we're seeing today. And it wasn't as concentrated and as brutal and as shameless as what we're seeing today. There wasn't this deliberate targeting of civilians in the same way that we're seeing today. There weren't, these sniper shots to the heads of children, this systematic genocide that we're seeing unfolding. And again, the whole moral claim of the West is supposed to be, well, we saved the day when there was a genocide, the ultimate genocide. But now they're letting it happen. They're making it happen. They are enablers. They're more than enablers.
Hasan, this is really fascinating conversation, and I really would like to explore so many strands there. And I think our viewers will probably suggest that we need to have you back in the studio to talk about a lot of this in a lot more detail. But let's talk about the Islam part of this, because I was struck by a phrase you used in that conversation, that Islam provides a counter-hegemony. Unpack that for me. What is it about Islam? Because, of course, that's not, many Muslims, but certainly non-Muslims will not see, they'd notice your critique, and very many will agree with your critique of modernity. But Islam doesn't seem the automatic faith, at least for non-Muslims, to go to provide this counter-hegemony. So explain that counter-hegemony idea to me, please.
Well, what I meant by that is really that this is to view Islam in a negative light from the liberalist perspective. But what it also exposes, in a way, I mean, I don't necessarily want to use that sensationalist language, is the fact that liberalism is hegemonic.
Yeah.
Now, that's paradoxical, because one of the core principles of liberalism is it is setting up the society in the kind of rules-in way. Let's not go there to rules, but let's say it's setting up the society in this neutral way so that everyone is able to pursue their own vision of the good without let or hindrance.
Yeah.
Now, there's one exception to this. If your pursuit of the good would serve to undermine liberalism itself, that's a great danger for them, because they'll say, oh, well, what will happen to the pluralism? It will be awful. We won't be able to host all of these different arbitrary beliefs anymore. So I wasn't necessarily saying we should view Islam as a counter-hegemony, because I wouldn't use that word myself. I don't think we purport to be or aspire to be hegemonic in that sense.
Yeah.
But absolutely, we offer an alternative that is a comprehensive view of existence. It's also the framework in which you accommodate diversity. And, we were second to none. We are the gold standard in Islam in terms of the historical record, in terms of our civilizational principles for accommodating the other. in a real way that doesn't relativize, that doesn't say you can have your own silly private belief in the wrong name and all that kind of stuff, as long as you're exactly the same as us in every way.
Yeah.
In what matters, which is contributing to the economy and so on, having working and contributing in academically and the arts, in media and whatever it happens to me. The Mehdi Hassans of the world, for example. I'm not saying anything about him as a person because I don't know, but I'm just saying he's attractive to that mindset that he's just one of us, but he's a Muslim, and we can relate to him. Not saying anything about obviously his personal level of commitment, which I think is very strong actually, but just the way that he's perceived. So this is, I think, a real issue for liberalism is the extent to which it can tolerate real diversity, not just superficial diversity.
Yeah.
Remember, on empiricism, all that really exists are empirical properties. So that's what they can tolerate. But when it comes to real conviction, would they have, okay, now they've managed to tick that box of diversity because they've had Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister. Yeah. But if he had been a Sufi sheikh and an alim, would they have let him?
Yeah.
No, it's because he's more neoliberal than the neoliberals. So all that diversity, how is that diversity? What's diverse about him?
You can say he had to overcompensate, and as you said, he was more Thatcherite than most conservatives were at this stage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Barack Obama was more establishment than the establishment.
Yeah.
So I think that's always, I think that kind of shows what I'm getting at when I say that liberalism is not really capable of tolerating Islam on any real level.
Yeah.
Now, our approach as Muslims, look, I want us to have this knowledge of critique so that we can be empowered by it.
Right.
Not so that we can be disempowered by it, go into our ghettos and our bubbles and say, oh, they're bad and modernity is bad and all that. No, there's much good in modernity. There's good in everything which Allah Ta'ala has created. And there's much good in the non-Muslim population of the West. Many good human beings who are on a good fitrah, a good original disposition, many future Muslims, many people of good faith and goodwill. But I think it's also important to realize that simply contributing to modern liberal secular society, it's always going to be unsatisfying for us, ultimately as Muslims, if that's where the buck stops. That's all there is to it. Because there is a telos, there is a purpose, just as in any social configuration and political structure, there is a telos to modern liberal society, just as there is a telos to, and I'm speaking in the very broadest sense, to Islamic civilization and to Islamic political systems and Islamic polities and every political system you can think of. And the telos of modern liberal civilization is the facilitation of arbitrary self-determination, I would say. And there are other ways of looking at it. If you're looking at it from an economic lens, you'd say something else. And that may be more of an overarching telos. And if you wanted to be cynical, you could say all of the stuff about freedom is just to distract you while you're being exploited economically and so on. And that what is really happening is that we're ruled by an oligarchy and so on. There's a lot of truth to all of that kind of thing, but I don't particularly want to go there now. I just think that as Muslims, we need to be empowered by this knowledge so that we can stop being bound by the narrative of contributing and we're British too and don't worry about us, we're just like you and so on. Yes, on a human level, we're just like you, but no, on another level, we have something to offer you, to help you, to save you, to open your mind, to liberate you, not in your conception of world religions, oh, you're trying to force your religion on me. No, in the sense that if you can deconstruct the assumptions that non-Muslims hold about modernity, which are not true, just like we hold them, then you can say there's a completely different way of looking at the world, which is not a question of blind faith, you becoming a Muslim. It's you seeing something about the world that you were veiled from previously by those assumptions. And that's where we say, look, Islam is not a religion of blind faith and identity, and in which case, why on earth would an English person want to become a Muslim? It takes away all of the familiarity and intimacy they have with their own environment, their own cultures, their own culture, their own history, their own architecture, their own built environment, so on. But it's something completely different to that, and it is unifying, reunifying what should be whole, but which has been severed systematically and ideologically in Western history, and those are the 5 bifurcations. And what is most significant, and I think this is really what we've been building up to, is that what is severed in the Christian, post-Christian world has always been whole and unified and indivisible and integral in the Muslim world. There's no split between law and spirit. There's no split between temporal power and sacred power. There's no split between faith and reason. There's no split between knowing subject and nature. And there's no split between morality and ontology. And so what we need to do is, on the community level, our neighbors, Muslim and non-Muslim, but I'm thinking mostly about the Muslim as a starting point, is on the level of our neighbors, on the level of families and friends and the larger community, that we enact on a community level, we start to instantiate on a community level what Tashkub-Rezada and the great Ottoman theorists of ethics like him call Madinat al-Mahabba, where the telos, the purpose of our human association in societies, is the cultivation of love of God and love of fellow man. And so it's essentially instantiating the prophetic model, making sure that there's no one left behind. Who do we know who is in trouble? Who do we know who is in need? Who do we know who is in poverty? And on a level of devotion, on a level of spirituality, having gatherings, instantiating gatherings within our communities where we have dhikr, we have this deep experiential appreciation of the deen, and we make sure to cultivate that. And we cultivate that also with the social level and, the on-the-ground level, the grassroots level. There's so many families, there's so many individuals who are victims of this socially atomized society. We have to stop leaving them behind and leaving them there on their own, and not allowing them to have a place where they can be embraced and brought in. That means bringing back zakat on a community and local level, and it means putting in place all of the institutions, well, not all of the institutions, it has to be obviously to some degree compromised by it being on a community level rather than a state level, but the institutions that in a traditional Islamic society are put in place, like the awqaf, for example, which obviously, very, very wide-ranging on the level of patronage of intellectual activity and on the level of looking after the poor, and of course on the level of madrasas. And the good news is a lot of this is happening. There's a kind of renaissance of all of this kind of activity in our communities. I just think that it needs to be, as we move forward, more focused on classical ethical models more explicitly, because I think there's a lot there which can inspire us, so that we can become more organized. The problem with organization is it can start to happen on, a kind of Weberian rationalized level, and that's not what we want. We need a traditional understanding that our associations are for a purpose, which is, and ultimately on the most fundamental level in Islam, it's the vicegerency, it's the custodianship, it's the stewardship of the world. And we need to show non-Muslims, not because we want to show them anything, but because this is the reality of our religion. We're not realizing it, that our religion is holistic. It encompasses everything. Unfortunately, the ghettos that we live in, that kind of ghettoization, while very understandable and not in any way to discredit the enormous, huge contributions of the communities that have come here and established Islam, who, as they say in Arabic, al-ayn wal-ra's, we have maximal respect for them. But moving forward, we need to have an Islam which is holistic, which embraces every aspect of life. Not this sense that somehow we're a kind of, almost like Orthodox Judaism. We're so concerned about being pure and pure of outside influences that we end up, just being in this insular and so on. And I'm afraid that I'm far from the first person to have said this. And I appreciate, obviously, the challenges which have led to that situation.
How much of what you're saying is for a greater purpose? While you were speaking there, until you caveated at the end, it sounded very similar to Rod Dreher and his Benedict option, the idea that modernity now is so overpowering and so strong, we can no longer defeat or critique modernity in a substantial way. And so we need to hold on to our goods as best as possible. Like, is that the ultimate end of this community building project, or do you feel that there can be a resurgence beyond holding on to Islam and building these institutions, in so much as, in my introduction I mentioned the author whose name I forget, who wrote the book After Defeat, and almost like an acceptance that Islam, like Catholicism, has to accept that it's never going to return in an Ottoman-esque way. Like, do you believe that the great days, the great history of Islam is in the past, and now it's sort of, we have to create a living which accepts begrudgingly the precepts of modernity?
Well, look, we don't know where we are in the eschatological story. We don't know it precisely, but what we do know is the Prophet ﷺ said, "Aw kama qala," he said, if the hour comes upon you and you have a seedling, فَلْيَغْرِسْهَا, you have to plant it, regardless of where you are, regardless of how dire things look.
Yeah.
And so we are not charged to know where we are. In the story of the is a resurgence possible? Is it impossible? We don't know. What we know is this is Allah's plan. This is His affair, as it says, even as it says in the Quran, directed towards the Prophet ﷺ, "Laysa laka min al-amri shay." You have nothing in this affair. This is God's affair. This is His decree unfolding. I've said, and I was criticized widely for it, that modernity our present situation vis-a-vis modernity and feeling defeated by it is not so much because of our failure to progress as it is an eschatological exigency. This has to happen. This has to happen. It's part of the what we're told has to happen in the latter days. Now, those latter days, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, I have no idea. And I don't think anyone should bother themselves with that. Yeah. All we know is that if we have a seedling, we have to plant it, right? So we can't have a defeatist attitude. We have the revealed truth. We have the transformative truth. We have to reconnect with those individuals who are still carrying that and inheriting that. And I'm a firm believer in the reality of sainthood, the reality of individuals who are true inheritors of the Prophet ﷺ on an inward level. And I think that's normative to our tradition. And I think another aspect of our weakness is the loss of that conception. And there are a lot of frauds. There's a lot of fraudulent claims. There are a lot of charlatans. But the existence of those should not blind us from the existence of wilaya. I think that is something that we absolutely, it's part and parcel of Islam. It goes right back to the original sources, to the understanding of wilaya. And we need to reconnect to that and, separate the wheat from the chaff. There are a lot of charlatans and there are criteria. So we have to be very, very careful, but not to the extent that it blinds us from the reality, because that's our real connection. Islam is a transformative path like no other. And that's what we need to communicate, I think, to non-Muslims on a dawah level, is that this is a liberation. And this is a comprehensive way of life which will get you out of that rut and enable you to become a truly fulfilled person. And at the end of the day, yes, I believe that modernity can be saved, and it can be saved by Islam. And I think that that's what we should be doing here. It's not a question that it's going to happen in the West or it's going to happen in the Muslim world, or we have to make hijrah or we have to stay here. I think in both are serious options and should remain serious options. But I think what has to be recognized is that the illusion of a universal, neutral civilization has infected the West and the Muslim world alike, almost universally in the Muslim world. Yeah. But I think real Islam will overcome in both cases, inshallah ta'ala.
Hasan Spiker, I think on that note, Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for your time today and our conversation. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Wa iyyakum.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.